The flames didn't just kill, they purified, at least that's what they believed. For centuries, across medieval Europe and beyond, burning at the stake wasn't just a punishment. In the eyes of the church and the state, heresy was a disease, and if one soul questioned the divine order, others might follow. The solution was fire. Heretics, unlike ordinary criminals, were not just breaking laws, they were defying heaven. So the church handed them over to the authorities, who lit the torches and watched the flames do the rest. The idea was that fire purified the soul. Even as the body turned to ash, perhaps, just perhaps, the soul might be redeemed. A teenage girl who led French troops to victory, claiming visions from God. She terrified the English and confounded the church. In England, Protestants and Catholics burned each other depending on who wore the crown. In colonial Latin America, the Spanish Inquisition burned indigenous people who resisted conversion. Even in Salem, Massachusetts, while most witches were hanged, the fear that led to fire burned just as hot. And not just any death, a death designed to be seen, feared, and remembered. When they burned someone at the stake, they weren't just trying to end a life. They were trying to erase an idea, a belief, a defiance. And for a time, it worked. The flames silenced thousands. Queen Mary I, a Catholic, earned the nickname Bloody Mary for burning nearly 300 Protestants alive. Decades later, Protestants returned the favor under a Protestant monarchy. They were branded as witches, heretics, traitors. But many were simply people who spoke differently, believed differently, or refused to bow. And though the fire took their lives, it couldn't extinguish their truth. The flames didn't care about doctrine, they devoured anyone labeled a threat. And in 1431, after a sham trial, she was declared a heretic. They tied her to the stake in Rouen marketplace. By the 18th century, many countries abolished it, recognizing it as cruel and inhumane. But its legacy lingered. Even as laws changed, the memory of fire remained, etched into the DNA of Western justice, religion, and collective trauma. The fear it created, the obedience it demanded, and the lives it consumed shaped history in ways we still feel. She was 19. As the fire rose around her, she called on Jesus. Witnesses said the flames parted briefly around her body, and many wept. But it was too late. The church had spoken. Her ashes were thrown in the river, so no one could venerate what remained. 25 years later, she was declared innocent. But the fire had already done its work. But for many, the fire was a sentence to eternal damnation. It wasn't just death. It was erasure. A fiery message carved into collective memory: deviate from the faith, and this is your end. To save souls, they destroyed bodies. It was punishment, execution, and public lesson all in one. It was a public spectacle. A ritual. A warning. Fire was seen as the great cleanser, consuming sin and heresy, sending the condemned into judgment before God. From accused witches and religious dissenters to political rebels and outcasts, thousands were bound to wooden posts, surrounded by fuel, and set ablaze in front of silent or cheering crowds. And the most terrifying part? Most believed it was just. It began with fear, the kind that creeps into a society when religion and power are one. The Inquisition, perhaps the darkest chapter in this history, perfected the process. Led by religious courts across Europe, from Spain to Italy to France, the inquisitors questioned, tortured, and condemned anyone accused of spreading false doctrine. They often forced confessions under unbearable pain, and once guilt was admitted, real or imagined, the sentence was fire. Auto de fe, or act of faith, became mass events where the condemned were paraded through town, then marched to burning sites as priests chanted and citizens watched. The message was clear: obey the church or burn like dry wood. But it wasn't just heretics who met the flames. Women accused of witchcraft were especially vulnerable. As hysteria grew across Europe in the 15th to 17th centuries, thousands of women, often poor, widowed, midwives, or simply different, were labeled as witches. Accusations flew from neighbors, courts, and clergy. A sick child, a failed crop, a sudden death, these were proof of sorcery. Trials were often a formality. And the punishment? Fire. Witch burnings became common in Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, with townsfolk gathering around the stake to watch evil be cleansed. What made burning at the stake so horrifying wasn't just the pain, it was the theology behind it. One of the most famous victims was Joan of Arc. It's easy to see this punishment as a relic of medieval madness, but it lasted longer than many realize. And it wasn't just Europe. The flames reached the Americas too. Burning at the stake eventually faded with time, as Enlightenment ideals and legal reforms spread. Today, we see fire differently: warmth, light, power. But in the past, fire meant death. But not forever. Because history remembers. And behind the smoke and ash of centuries past, we still hear their voices, shaking, defiant, brave.